This is Chapter 15, Part B on the endocrine system. So last section in Part A, we looked at the anterior and pituitary glands and their hormones. This section will look at the remainder of the endocrine system organs and their respective hormones. Right, so the first gland we'll look at today is the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is a small butterfly-shaped gland that's in the anterior portion of the neck, just below the larynx. So it consists of the isthmus. So this is just this median, kind of narrow region that connects the two halves of the thyroid gland. Okay, so looking at the tissue of the thyroid gland, we have two different types of cells because the thyroid is going to create two different types of hormones, calcitonin and thyroid hormone. So looking at the tissue, so we have follicles. So these are hollow spheres made up of follicular cells, right, or follicle cells. Right. So within these follicles and these follicular cells, we have a glycoprotein called thyroglobulin. So these follicles contain what's called colloid. So it's the fluid within the follicle containing this thyroid globulin plus iodine. So iodine is the precursor to thyroid hormone. It's going to combine with the thyroglobulin to create the thyroid hormone. Right, so this is why iron is very important in the diet. The parafollicular cells are going to produce another hormone we'll talk about in a little while called calcitonin. So again, para means beside or next to. So these are cells that are beside or next to our follicular cells. Thyroid hormone is the body's major metabolic hormone. It's typically found in two forms, T4 and T3, thyroxine and triiodothyronine. So the only difference between these two are the number of iodine atoms bonded to the tyrosine molecule. So T4 would have 4 iodine atoms, T3 only has 3 iodine atoms. But they both have similar function in that they're going to help regulate and maintain the body's metabolism. Thyroid hormone affects virtually every cell in the body. So this is why we call it the major metabolic hormone. So every cell has to undergo metabolism and cellular reactions. So they're all going to have receptors for this thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone is lipid soluble, meaning that it's able to enter the target cell, so it's able to pass through that plasma membrane, that phospholipid bilayer, and bind directly to intracellular receptors within the nucleus. So we go back to that direct gene activation mechanism of action. So it's able to trigger transcription of various genes, meaning it's able to directly turn on those genes to have those functions or those proteins. So some effects of thyroid hormone include increasing basal metabolic rate and heat production. So this is where we said it's the major metabolic hormone. It's virtually driving your entire metabolism. So heat production is just a byproduct of our metabolism. So when we transfer energy from sugar in our food into ATP energy, some of that energy is going to be lost as heat during the transfer process. Thyroid hormone also helps to regulate tissue growth and development. So this is critical for your normal skeletal and nervous system development as well as reproductive function. Right? And it's also going to help to maintain blood pressure by increasing those adrenergic receptors in blood vessels. Thyroid hormone is just like a lot of the other hormones we've already talked about in that they operate under a negative feedback mechanism. So falling thyroid hormone levels would stimulate release of a thyroid stimulating hormone. So once thyroid hormone levels raise back up to homeostatic levels, right, so then we would undergo negative feedback to turn off that thyroid stimulating hormone and the thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So this is a table showing some major effects of thyroid hormone in the body. So as you can see, it's pretty widespread throughout the body and affects virtually every cell. It's like we said, every cell has to undergo metabolism to survive and make energy. So basal metabolic rate, temperature regulation, carbohydrate, lipid, protein, nutrient metabolism, nervous system development, cardiovascular system function, muscular system development and function, growth and maturation of the skeletal system, secretion of digestive juices, GI motility, female reproductive ability, lactation, and normal hydration and secretory activity of the skin. So just as with everything in the body, we want to maintain that homeostatic range or balance. So too much or too little of anything generally is not a good thing, right? So a hyposecretion of thyroid hormone in adults, so meaning not enough thyroid hormone, can lead to what's called myxedema. So symptoms include low metabolic rate, obviously, because they don't have enough thyroid hormone, puffy eyes, chills, constipation, sluggishness. Um, if the hyposecretion is due to a lack of iodine, then we have what's called a goiter may develop. So the lack of iodine is going to decrease your thyroid hormone levels. So that's going to trigger more thyroid stimulating hormone secretion, right? So we're going to crank out more TSH to try to stimulate that thyroid to secrete thyroid hormone. So triggering that thyroid is going to start to synthesize more and more of that thyroid globulin. But remember, the thyroid globulin is going to combine and bind to the iodine atoms to make thyroid hormone. So if we don't have enough iodine, we have all of this unusable thyroid globulin that starts to accumulate in the thyroid, causing it to enlarge. So if this hyposecretion were to occur in an infant, this would be called cretinism. So symptoms of cretinism include intellectual disabilities, kind of short, disproportionately sized bodies, thick tongue, neck. So hyposecretion of thyroid hormone would generally be more damaging to an infant or a child because their cells are more rapidly growing and dividing, so they have a requirement for much higher metabolism. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we could have a hypersecretion of thyroid hormone where we have too much. So the most common type of hypersecretion is called Graves' disease. So this is an autoimmune disease where the body's going to make antibodies directed against its own thyroid follicular cells. So these antibodies are going to behave like thyroid stimulating hormone in that they stimulate thyroid hormone release. So some symptoms include elevated metabolic rate, sweating, rapid irregular heart beats, nervousness, weight loss despite eating enough food. One of the most hallmark symptoms of Graves' disease, though, is the bulging eyes. Right, so this is due to as fluid builds up behind the eyes, they start to protrude forward. So treatments for Graves' disease include things like surgical removal of the thyroid or adding radioactive iodine atoms to destroy those affected thyroid cells. The second hormone produced by the thyroid gland is called calcitonin. So calcitonin is produced by these parafollicular cells in response to high blood calcium levels. So this is going to be antagonistic to parathyroid hormone. So when calcitonin is released at higher than normal levels, it can work to inhibit your osteoclast activity and prevent release of calcium from the bone matrix. So remember from Anatomy 1, osteoclasts are those breakdown cells that break down the bone to free up the calcium. So we can inhibit or turn off that osteoclast activity to reserve our calcium in the bone matrix. Calcitonin also helps to stimulate more calcium uptake and incorporation into the bone matrix from things like the kidneys and the digestive system. So our next endocrine organs are the parathyroid glands. So these are just 4 to 8 tiny yellow-brown glands embedded in the posterior part of the thyroid. So these parathyroid cells are going to secrete parathyroid hormone, or PTH, or parathormone, sometimes referred to. So parathyroid hormone is most important in calcium homeostasis. It's going to be secreted in response to low blood calcium levels and inhibited by rising calcium levels, right, with that negative feedback. So once calcium levels return to homeostatic levels, parathyroid hormone production would be turned off. So target organs for parathyroid hormone are the skeletons. So it can increase that osteoclast activity, so we can stimulate more bone breakdown to free up the calcium. We can also stimulate the kidneys and the intestines to absorb more calcium into the blood. So like we just mentioned, parathyroid hormone is antagonistic to calcitonin. So where parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels, calcitonin decreases blood calcium levels. So again, parathyroid hormone can function to increase blood calcium 3 different ways. So we can increase the osteoclast activity to cause that bone breakdown to free up the calcium and release it into the blood. We can also stimulate the kidneys to reabsorb more calcium, right, during the filtration process. And we can also increase calcium absorption from food in the small intestine. So our next endocrine organ we'll look at is the adrenal glands. Right? So these are a paired pyramid-shaped organs that sit just on top of the kidneys. So sometimes you'll see them referred to as the suprarenal gland. So supra just means, you know, on top. So on top of the kidneys. So structurally and functionally, it is 2 glands in one. So it has both glandular tissue and nervous tissue, similar to like we had with the pituitary gland. So the adrenal cortex, or the outer region, consists of 3 different layers of glandular tissue that are going to secrete several different hormones that we'll look at. The adrenal medulla, or the middle portion, is going to be composed of nervous tissue that's part of the sympathetic nervous system, or that fight or flight nervous system. So we'll start by looking at the adrenal cortex. Okay, so the adrenal cortex actually can produce over 24 different hormones, collectively referred to as corticosteroids. Right? But we're just going to focus on some of the major hormones produced by the cortex. So 3 layers of the adrenal cortex are going to produce different types of these corticosteroids. So the zona glomerulosa is going to produce the mineralocorticoids, zona fasciculata produces glucocorticoids, and zona reticularis produces the gonadotropins. So the first group of corticoids are the mineralocorticoids. So these are going to regulate electrolyte concentrations, primarily sodium and potassium. Right? So think mineral, you know, your vitamins and minerals, so sodium, potassium, chloride, all those are considered minerals. Right? So the most important of the mineralocorticoids is aldosterone. So it's going to stimulate sodium reabsorption by the kidneys, which is going to ultimately result in an increase in blood volume and blood pressure. So sodium, think salt. So wherever sodium goes, water is going to follow, right? So if you eat a really salty meal, your mouth gets dry, you get thirsty because the water, right, is going to follow that sodium. So it's kind of an indirect mechanism to reabsorb more water by the kidneys and add more water and fluid to the blood. Instead of reabsorbing the water directly, we reabsorb the sodium, and the water is going to naturally follow it. Right? So sodium and potassium you can think of as being antagonistic to one another. So if sodium is moving in, then potassium has to move out. So aldosterone stimulates sodium reabsorption and simultaneously can stimulate potassium elimination. So the effects of aldosterone are generally short-lived. So as long as the aldosterone is being produced, it'll have the effect. Once we stop producing aldosterone, then the sodium reabsorption will stop. Right? So it's going to stimulate synthesis and activation of the sodium-potassium transport pump. So it's basically swapping sodium for potassium. So we're letting sodium in and we're pumping potassium out. So a couple of factors that can regulate aldosterone secretion. First and foremost would be the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism that we'll talk about shortly. Plasma concentration of potassium. So again, aldosterone is going to cause elimination of potassium. So if we have too much potassium, that can increase aldosterone production. Right? Also, if we don't have enough potassium, we could turn off aldosterone production. ACTH, right? So one of those tropic hormones, the adrenocorticotropic hormone from the pituitary, that's going to stimulate the aldosterone secretion. Another one is atrial natriuretic peptide that we'll talk about shortly, but it's essentially going to be antagonistic to the aldosterone. So instead of stimulating sodium reabsorption, it stimulates sodium secretion. So the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism is one of the most important mechanisms for aldosterone secretion. It's going to be stimulated by decreased blood pressure. So there's special cells in the kidneys that help to monitor blood pressure as it's being filtered. So once they detect that the blood pressure is too low, the kidney will then release an enzyme called renin. Okay. So renin is going to initiate a cascade or kind of a stepwise process that ultimately leads to production of aldosterone, but there's a few steps along the way. So one of kind of the intermediary molecules or substances in this process is angiotensin 2. Right. Angiotensin 2 by itself is a potent vasoconstrictor, so it can also help to increase blood pressure. But it's also going to stimulate release of aldosterone from the adrenal glands. So then adrenal glands release aldosterone. Aldosterone goes back to target the kidneys and tells the kidneys to absorb more sodium and excrete more potassium. So as we reabsorb more sodium, that means we're also reabsorbing more water. So that excess water we've reabsorbed now is going to go to the blood to increase our blood pressure and help to raise or increase our blood volume and help to raise our blood pressure. So this figure also shows the other mechanisms we mentioned. So just an increase in potassium concentration can also trigger aldosterone release because we want to secrete or get rid of that excess potassium. Adrenocorticotropic hormone can also stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. And then the antagonistic hormone, the atrial natriuretic peptide, AMP, is actually produced by the heart. So it's going to be released in when blood pressure is too high. So blood pressure gets too high, the heart releases the ANP, which turns off the aldosterone secretion. So if blood pressure is already high, right, we don't want to increase it even further, right? So we want to turn it down. So our next group of corticosteroids are the glucocorticoids. So these corticosteroids help to influence metabolism of most of the cells, help resist stress, also help keep blood glucose levels relatively constant, and help to maintain blood pressure. So some glucocorticoid hormones include cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone, but we're primarily going to focus just on cortisol or hydrocortisone because it's the only glucocorticoid in significant amounts in humans. So cortisol release is stimulated by ACTH or adrenocorticotropic hormone. So just like we had before with aldosterone, but now it's going to stimulate release of the cortisol. So the corticotropin releasing hormone sent from the hypothalamus, right, in response to low cortisol levels is going to increase secretion of ACTH. So once cortisol levels reach homeostasis, then we'll undergo negative feedback to turn off the corticotropin releasing hormone and the ACTH. So cortisol is sometimes referred to as one of the stress hormones, maybe a long-term stress hormone. So some long-term stress responses would be proteins and fats are converted to glucose or broken down for energy. Immune system can become suppressed, and blood glucose will increase. So cortisol causes an increase in the blood levels of glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. So its prime metabolic effect is gluconeogenesis, or formation of glucose from fats and proteins. So essentially it encourages the cells to use the fatty acids for fuel so the glucose can be saved for the brain activity. Some other function to include vasoconstriction, so we can cause a relatively quick rise in blood pressure when we need to distribute certain nutrients to certain cells. So one type of homeostatic imbalance with these corticosteroids could be a hypersecretion, which would lead to Cushing's disease or Cushing's syndrome. So this presents with relatively rapid weight gain, moon face, or a humpback. So some effects of Cushing's include depresses the cartilage and bone formation, depresses the immune system, can inhibit the inflammatory response, and can also just disrupt general neural, cardiovascular, and gastrointestinal function. So it could be caused by a couple different factors. So it could be caused by a tumor on the pituitary gland, maybe leading to an over-secretion of the ACTH, or a tumor on the adrenal cortex itself. But more commonly, it's caused by an overuse of corticosteroids. So generally, treatment would be either to remove the tumor that's causing the hypersecretion or to just discontinue the drugs. So if someone has a hyposecretion, this can cause Addison's disease. So this would also involve deficits in the mineralocorticoids. So you'd have a decrease in blood sugar and blood sodium levels. Symptoms would include things like weight loss, dehydration, hypotension. But generally, it's easily treated with corticosteroid replacement therapy. Now, at the time, he kept it pretty well hidden, but JFK was actually had Addison's disease. So in his pictures where he looks like he has this nice tan, that's actually a symptom of the Addison's disease. So Addison's disease symptoms can present kind of a bronzing appearance of the skin. Okay, so the last group of corticosteroids are the gonatocorticoids, or the adrenal sex hormones. So these are weak androgens that are going to be converted to testosterone in tissue cells and some into estrogens. So these can help contribute to the onset of puberty, the appearance of those secondary sex characteristics like facial hair in men, broad shoulders, more muscle mass, bone density. Sex drive in women, and source of estrogens in postmenopausal women. So a hypersecretion of these gonatocorticoids could lead to what's called adrenogenital syndrome or a masculinization. So it's not really noticeable in adult males since they're already masculinized with testosterone, so maybe they just get more manly than before. But with females and prepubescent males, the symptoms are pretty noticeable, right? So with prepubescent males, the boys would have early maturation of the reproductive organs, or the secondary sex characteristics start to appear early, before puberty. In females, they would present with things like the beard or masculine pattern of body hair, or even the clitoris can start to enlarge and resemble a small penis. So we've all heard of the bearded ladies, right, in the old-timey kind of sideshows. So this lady is suffering from a hypersecretion of those gonatocorticoids. Okay, so we said the adrenal medulla was actually composed of neural tissue, so it's um, kind of the connection to the nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system of the adrenal gland. So cells within the adrenal medulla called medullary chromaffin cells are going to synthesize catecholamines. So the catecholamines are just a group of neurotransmitter hormones that includes epinephrine and norepinephrine. So some general effects of these catecholamines include vasoconstriction, increased heart rate, increased blood glucose levels, and blood can also be diverted to the brain, heart, and skeletal muscle. So kind of your most important primary organs for that fight or flight response. Right? So again, epinephrine produced by the adrenal medulla. Another name you might hear epinephrine called is adrenaline. So think when your adrenaline's pumping, right, your heart's racing, right, your blood pressure is increased, right, for that fight or flight response. Right, so here's a table summary of what we've discussed so far with the hormones produced by the adrenal gland. So we have our adrenocortical hormone. So the hormones are the regions of the cortex. Right? So your mineralocorticoids, that would be your aldosterone. Right? So stimulated by renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism with low blood pressure or elevated blood calcium levels and ACTH. Glucocorticoids, that would be your cortisol, stimulated by the ACTH. So again, this would be your body's major stress hormone. Right? So it helps to assist the body to resist stressors. Gonatocorticoids, so these would be things like testosterone, some estrogens, again stimulated by the ACTH. So effects aren't really that significant in males, but in females can cause kind of masculinization. And your adrenal medullary hormones, those catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, or just think adrenaline. Right? So this would be stimulated by that or the sympathetic nervous system. Right? So that's the nervous tissue part of the adrenal gland. Right? That fight or flight. Right? So the next endocrine organ we'll look at is the pineal gland. So it's just a small gland that hangs inside the brain. Here. So it secretes a hormone called melatonin, which is responsible for regulating our sleep-wake cycles. So it's going to receive input from the visual pathways to determine timing of day and night. So if it's daylight outside, light would be an inhibitor of melatonin release, whereas the absence of light or darkness would stimulate melatonin release to tell our brain that it's nighttime, that it's time to get ready to go to sleep. Right, so melatonin, you may have heard of before, you can actually buy it over the counter as a sleep aid. Our next endocrine organ is the pancreas. It's a small triangular gland located partially behind the stomach. So the pancreas is a little bit different than other endocrine organs we've talked about so far in that it has both exocrine and endocrine function. So the exocrine portion of the pancreas is composed of the acinar cells. So these are going to produce some enzyme-rich juice for digestion. So the endocrine portion would be the pancreatic islets, sometimes called the islets of Langerhans. So there's two types of endocrine cells that are going to secrete two different types of hormones. So the alpha cells, which are the darker pink ones here, are going to produce glucagon. The beta cells, the lighter pinkish purplish ones, are going to produce insulin. Okay. So in this pancreas tissue picture, so the islets of Langerhans, think kind of like an island. So they're these little islands within the tissue space. So all of this surrounding the islet are your acinar cells for your exocrine digest juice production. So I said the pancreas produces two hormones, and they're actually going to be antagonistic to one another. So the first one we'll look at is glucagon. So glucagon is released by a decrease in blood glucose levels. So its function is to raise blood glucose levels, typically by targeting the liver to break down glycogen into glucose. This process is called glycogenolysis. So glycogen is basically the storage form for glucose. So we have excess sugar or glucose in the blood is converted into glycogen and stored in the liver. So if we need to raise our blood glucose, we can tap into those reserves and break down that glycogen into free glucose. We can also synthesize glucose from lactic acid. So gluconeogenesis, right? So this neo means new, so we're forming new glucose, right? Lysis means to split or break apart. So here we're just splitting glycogen, but here we're creating new glucose from things like lactic acid or non-carbohydrates. But either way, we're going to release glucose into the blood to raise those blood glucose levels. So insulin is the second pancreatic hormone. So it's going to be secreted when blood glucose levels increase. So insulin works to lower blood glucose in 3 ways. So we can enhance the membrane transport of glucose into our fat and muscle cells. So basically we can allow the cells to be better able to take up the glucose into their cells and use it. We can inhibit the breakdown of glycogen to glucose. So if we have enough sugar in the blood, we don't need to add any more. We can stop tapping into that glycogen, right, and save it for later. Or we could inhibit that conversion of amino acids or fats to glucose. But either way, we're stopping production of new glucose and we're decreasing the amount of glucose we already have. So this figure is showing how both insulin and glucagon can work to maintain blood glucose levels. So if we have balance, we have our normal blood glucose level here. So say now we have an increase in our blood glucose level. So blood sugar is too high, right? So that's going to stimulate the pancreas to secrete insulin. So then insulin can stimulate production of glycogen so that any excess glucose we can store in the liver as glycogen. We can also take that excess glucose out of the blood by the cell. So the cells can take in that glucose and use it for their own energy metabolism. So as a result, blood glucose levels are going to fall back down to normal range, right? So the negative feedback, we would turn off insulin production in the pancreas. The other side of the coin, if we had a decrease in blood glucose levels, right, so blood sugar is too low, the pancreas will secrete glucagon. So glucagon is going to stimulate glycogen breakdown. So we're going to free up that glucose, tap into our reserves, right, release it to the blood, and now blood sugar has returned back to normal levels. So the negative feedback, right, we would go back to the pancreas, turn it off, right, turn glucagon production off. So we don't add any more glucose to the blood. So diabetes is the most common homeostatic imbalance when it comes to insulin. Right? So there's 2 types of diabetes. So type 1 diabetes would be a hyposecretion of insulin. So this would be where, for whatever reason, the person's pancreas just does not produce enough insulin on its own. So type 2 diabetes would be a hypoactivity of insulin. So even though we can produce insulin, the cells are like desensitized to it. So they're not going to respond. Right? So we have a decreased activity of insulin. So ultimately, when blood glucose levels remain elevated, the person can feel nauseated, which could then trigger a sympathetic fight or flight response, which could then act to further increase blood glucose levels. So kind of a snowball effect. So one of the symptoms of diabetes is glycosuria, which would be where excess glucose is spilled into the urine. So the kidneys can only filter out so much, the blood can only handle so much sugar. So any excess is going to be filtered out into the urine and can be detected. So back in the olden days of medicine, one of the ways that doctors could diagnose a patient with diabetes would be to taste their urine. So if they tasted sweetness or sugar in the urine, then that would be positive for diabetes. So thankfully, we've made some advancements since then, so we no longer have to do that. So the three cardinal signs of diabetes is polyuria, which would be an increased urine output. So that excess glucose in the urine is going to also act as an osmotic diuretic, meaning that as the excess glucose enters the urine, it's also going to carry water with it. So we'll lose excess water along with the excess glucose. Another cardinal sign is polydipsia, which is excessive thirst. So this would be a consequence from the water loss due to the polyuria. So if you're producing more urine, right, you're losing more water, right, that's going to increase your thirst to try to replace that lost water. And then the third sign is polyphagia. So this would be excessive hunger and food consumption. So the person could be eating all day and still feel hungry because the cells are unable to take up that glucose and energy. So essentially the cells are sending a signal that they're starving. They need glucose. But even though the person's producing insulin, right, the cells aren't able to respond to the insulin and take up the glucose. So while they're not considered true endocrine organs, the gonads and the placenta are also capable of producing some of those steroid sex hormones. So the ovaries produce estrogens and progesterone. So estrogen is going to increase the maturation of the reproductive organs, the appearance of the secondary sexual characteristics, so increased fat deposition around the hips, the breasts, right? With progesterone, it can cause breast development and those cyclical changes in the uterus. The testes in the male produce testosterone, which is going to initiate the maturation and development of the male reproductive organs, can also cause appearance of those secondary sexual characteristics and sex drive. So things like facial hair, right, increased muscle mass, bone density, the deeper voice that males have. Testosterone is also necessary for normal sperm production and helps to maintain the reproductive organs in a functional state. So the placenta can also secrete hormones like estrogens, progesterone, and a unique hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. So this is the hormone that those home pregnancy tests test for. So the placenta is the only organ that produces this hormone. So if this hormone is present, then you would have to be pregnant. So this is just showing kind of how different hormones are released throughout development, throughout pregnancy. So initially, the placenta is going to secrete the HCG, and the ovary is going to secrete majority of the progesterone and estrogen. So as the placenta develops, it will start to take over that progesterone and estrogen production until ultimately in the third trimester, all hormone production is coming from the placenta and no longer from the ovaries. Some other tissues and organs that can produce hormones, even though they're not technically part of the endocrine system. So adipose tissue is one, so fat cells can produce a hormone called leptin, which stimulates increased energy expenditure and maintains appetite control. The gastrointestinal tract has special enteroendocrine cells that can secrete hormones like gastrin, which stimulates release of hydrochloric acid. Ghrelin from the stomach stimulates food intakes, one of the hunger hormones. And cholecystokinin, or CCK, is going to activate the pancreas, the gallbladder, and the hepatopancreatic sphincter to secrete certain digestive juices throughout the process. So we've already talked about this one a little bit, the atrial natriuretic peptide produced by the heart. So we said it was antagonistic to aldosterone because it's going to decrease blood calcium or blood sodium levels. So when blood pressure gets too high, Right, so as blood passes through the heart, the chambers of the heart, they have special stretch receptors called baroreceptors that detect the pressure of the blood as it flows through the heart. So if pressure gets too high, right, so we're stretching that heart muscle too much, the heart will release this atrial natriuretic peptide to help decrease the blood pressure and reduce any risk of damaging the heart or the blood vessels. So it targets can target the kidneys to turn off renin release, which would stop that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. Um, could lead to vasodilation, so we open up the blood vessels to lower the pressure. But primarily, like I said, we're going to turn off aldosterone and we're going to stimulate the kidneys to secrete more sodium. Right? So as we secrete more sodium, as that sodium leaves the body, water is going to follow along with it. So ultimately, that decreases the volume of the blood and decreases the blood pressure. The kidneys are also capable of producing two important hormones. Right? So the first one is erythropoietin. So this is the hormone that stimulates red blood cell production. So we'll talk about later in the blood chapter about blood cell production, but all blood cells originate in the bone marrow. So the kidneys release the erythropoietin. Right? It stimulates the bone marrow to make new red blood cells to increase our oxygen carrying capacity. Another hormone secreted by the kidneys that we've already talked about is renin. So renin is released when blood pressure is too low. Right? So it starts that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. So ultimately, we release aldosterone, which causes the kidneys to increase sodium reabsorption and therefore water reabsorption. So when we add more water and fluid to the blood, that's going to increase our blood pressure. The skeleton, the bones, can also secrete a hormone. So osteoblasts in bone are going to secrete osteocalcin. So osteocalcin helps to stimulate the pancreas to secrete more insulin. It helps to restrict fat storage, improve glucose handling, and helps to reduce body fat. The skin can also produce two important hormones. Kind of like hormones, we call it vitamin D though. So cholecalciferol is the precursor to vitamin D. So that's why we say you need sunlight for vitamin D. So UV radiation is going to activate this precursor into the active form of vitamin D, which is also called calcitriol. So vitamin D is important in calcium absorption from the intestines. Also helps to modulate the immune response, decrease inflammation, and may act as an anti-cancer agent. So vitamin D is going to be important for bone health, right, and calcium levels. So our last endocrine organ we'll look at is the thymus. So the thymus is unique in that it's only active in children. So it's fairly large sized in children and infants. And as we reach adulthood, as we age, it kind of shrinks and shrivels up. So the thymus is where T cells of our immune system go to develop and mature. Right? So as a child, your immune system is still developing, right? But as an adult, it's pretty well established. So that's why it's not really active in adults, right? So our immune system is already developed and established. We no longer need a thymus. Okay. So some hormones secreted by the thymus, so thymulin, thymopotentins, and thymosins, but they're all going to be involved in that development of the T lymphocytes from the immune system. So even though we talk about these in the endocrine system chapter, they're not true hormones in the true sense of the words because they're going to act as paracrines. So remember, a hormone is a long distance chemical signal. right? So a paracrine is going to affect a neighboring cell or a cell within the same tissue area. So because of this, the thymus releases hormones that affect the thymus. So technically, they are going to act as a paracrine and not a hormone.